So, though this class is mainly focused on statistical techniques, creating what is called quantitative data, descriptive data, looking at both experimental, quasi-experimental, and non-experimental designs, I did want to spend a little bit of time talking about research methods that we're not necessarily as focused on, which are qualitative. So we're going to talk a little bit about how rigor and bias is always important no matter what the methods are we're using, and talk about some of the actual systematic methodology used for these techniques, and some also the appropriate statistics. And in this case, we're talking less about numerical statistics and more about basically just ways to categorize the data. So why do psychologists act the way they act? The canons of scientific experimentation, and again, this is where we're going to start as we move away from scientific experimentation, is determinism, empiricism, parsimony, and testability. So basically, if we're looking at a quasi-experimental or experimental design, we're looking at something that generally is going to, one, have an assumption of determinism. All events have a meaningful systematic cause. In other words, we believe that when we're looking at this from a scientific viewpoint, this is one of our assumptions, one of our worldviews, that there is a cause and effect system in place that is knowable. We're then going to move forward to empiricism, that the best way to know about what is going on, this systematic cause and event structure, is through empiricism, observation. So how do we observe what is occurring in order to determinism, what's actually happening? When we combine determinism and empiricism, we're going to try to come up with a theory or basically a suggestion of what is the patterns we're observing. And in this case, we want to assume parsimony, that the simplest description that explains most of what's going on is usually the best explanation. In other words, that we want to avoid complexity for complexity's sake. And finally, once we have a theory that we have put together through determinism, through empiricism, and we've put it through the lens of parsimony, that theory should be testable or falsifiable. In other words, other people, including ourselves, but other researchers, other consumers of research, can take a look at that theory and basically be able to test it themselves. Is there support? Is there evidence in a deterministic and empiricistic way to support this? So these are the kind of rigor and methodology that we find in most quantitative research, and quantitative just means numerical, where we're actually looking for broad trends that we can relate back to the public population. However, we want to keep these in mind even when we're doing quote unquote non-experimental or quasi-experimental designs. As much as we can, we should still be grounded in the science of the methodology. Can we think of this deterministically? And in fact, a lot of non-experimental designs are looking for not the causes themselves, but to be able to define what are the effects or what are the causes in individual. So one of the ways to think of non-experimental designs are designs that it's hard to actually identify both independent variables and dependent variables. They're usually focused on one or the other and being able to basically fully define what that variable is. So in other words, we're going to observe that variable in a deterministic way to come up with theories that are parsimonious, but are testable, but are not necessarily being tested in this particular experiment or this particular study. So the criteria of scientific methodology, this is something that, again, we're going to be putting on top of any research we do, whether it's non-experimental, quasi-experimental, or experimental, is first, can it be observed? Can we tangibly collect the data that we're interested in? And there are some things that may not be observable. We sometimes have to make inferences about those observations. Think about a lot of psychological constructs. So it's hard to actually observe directly measurement of if someone is extroverted or introverted. However, we have come up with ways to infer that we can make those observations. We can look to see human behaviors, human responses that basically indicate this less than easily observed variable. There may be also situations where our technology just has not gotten to the point where we can observe the variables. For example, we look at the actual theory of the atom, the building block of almost all matter in the universe, and where that was a theory that existed in the time of ancient Greece. However, the ability to actually observe an atom did not occur until the 20th century when technology finally made that an observable construct. So once we know it can be observed, can we actually measure it? Can we come up with a standardized criteria that everyone would agree on as a way to measure it? Once we have that measurement, we create our theories. Can that theory be falsifiable? In other words, is there a way that we can set up an experiment that can either support that theory through observation or refute that theory? If we have a theory that basically, regardless of whether your experiment finds the results or not, for example, the concepts of Freudian unconsciousness. Well, if you don't find it, it's because it's unconscious. If you do find it, well, it's because you came up with a way to measure unconsciousness. That's not falsifiable. And that's one of the problems with some of the theories that we come up with. And finally, once we've created an ability to measure this, we've come up with an observable, objectively measurable way to measure something, we've come up with a study that's falsifiable, can we come up with a study that could be repeated? In other words, can other people test it? And this is the final kind of criteria of scientific methodology. Now, again, there are other ways to know the world other than scientific methodology. But if we're trying to be scientific, if we're trying to actually systematically study the world, we need to be hitting these four things, regardless of whether we're looking at non-experimental, quasi-experimental, or experimental studies. So as I said, we're going to be focusing on this particular lecture on non-experimental research methods. We should still be considering methodology, we should still be striving for rigor, but just recognize that our goal is somewhat different. In quasi-experimental and experimental designs, we're either trying to get closer to cause and effect or actually do cause and effect. And the big difference between quasi-experimental and experimental designs is both of them tend to be looking for patterns between independent variables and dependent variables. The question is, can the experimenter ethically, morally, or just practically take control of the independent variable to guarantee that it came before the dependent variable? So if I'm taking a group of people and randomly assigning them to either drink or not drink, that is an experimental design. Now, it may not be a very good one. We can still talk about the rigor of the design, but that's what's making it an experimental design. I have taken control of the IV, amount drunk, and then I'm looking at some form of outcome, a DV. That same study might be looking at, is there a difference between drinking in men and women? Now, I can't ethically, practically assign people to a gender or a biological sex in this case, but I can ask them to self-identify or use medical techniques or even use DNA to define these two groups into gender or sex, male and female, and then look for outcomes. That would be a quasi-experimental design. I still have an independent variable, I still have a dependent variable, but I can't really say that one causes the other. It may be, that gender does in fact influence the amount of drinking, but it also might be the other way around. We really just don't know specifically because I haven't taken direct control over my IV. Non-experimental designs basically are all the methods we use to basically just learn more about the world using the methodologies we've already talked about. So again, determinism, observation, parsimony, etc., empiricism. However, in this case, we're really just generally focusing on describing the world. We're not looking for relationships yet. So generally, when we're talking about non-experimental designs, we're talking about qualitative versus quantitative, but this is a bit of a false narrative. So qualitative simply means words, thoughts, and ideas, while quantitative means we've reduced those words, thoughts, and ideas into actual numerical data that we can statistically, mathematically look for patterns and relationships. All qualitative data can be measured and coded with quantitative methods. So we can always reduce qualitative methods, words and thoughts and ideas, into numbers. And quantitative research can be generated from qualitative inquiries. In fact, most of them are. So for example, we can code an open-ended interview with numbers that refer to data, specific references, or such references could become the origins of a randomized experiment. In other words, we might ask a bunch of people, when I say extroversion, what does it mean to you? And we come up with paragraphs full of words, thoughts, and ideas. From these, I might then create 5 questions that people rate on a 1 to 5 scale, which I then use later in experiments looking for the differences between people that are high or low on extroversion. So you can kind of see how these things work together. that when we move towards more experimental designs, we tend to be moving more towards quantitative research. And this is great for looking for mathematical patterns. However, it's hard to get there if we haven't already fully defined the constructs that we're interested in through qualitative or non-experimental research. Another way to look at this is qualitative research is viewed as confirmatory and deductive in nature, quantitative research is viewed as confirmatory, while qualitative research is considered to be exploratory and inductive. So inductive means we start with an observation, we then try to generalize it, and we try to create a theory. That's inductive, and that's generally qualitative. So basically, that is also generally non-experimental. We're looking at a single variable, whether it's human behavior, whether it's a construct, and we're coming up with our observations. How can we actually determine what's going on as far as this one variable is concerned? How can we generalize that to larger populations? And based on this, do we start to come up with a theory to explain how that works? Quantitative research is usually deductive. We start with the theory. So notice we've kind of skipped forward. We have a theory that talks about how these constructs are interrelated. We look at the productions, in other words, the kind of operationalizations, and then we create an experiment to test our theories, looking for these patterns. So you can kind of see how, though we are focused on the quantitative in this class and we're focused on the deductive, starting with a theory, coming up with operationalizations, creating an experiment, and then using the statistics to determine if there's a pattern, it's hard to do this if we haven't at least started with well-defined constructs through observational qualitative research or non-experimental research. So qualitative methods use loosely structured, open-ended questions to gather detailed information on broad topics. By comparison, qualitative data is presented in the form of sentences or descriptions of behavior rather than strict numerical values or codes. So generally, we're not necessarily going to be putting numbers. However, that doesn't mean that we don't have methodology to actually try to make this a more systematic process of understanding. So some of the features of qualitative methods, typically researchers interact with the participants. Not always, and we're going to talk about a few types that don't, but a lot of times they are interactions. They're interviews, they're observations, they're focus groups. Hypotheses are usually often loosely defined. In other words, there's not a causal hypothesis when we're looking at non-experimental qualitative methods. There may be a broad, loosely defined hypothesis. For example, I think people tend to vary on how they behave in various situations. But again, one of the ways to think about this is we're usually focused on one thing at a time, one construct. We're not looking for patterns or relationships between constructs. Consent may or may not be given, so sometimes it might be a formal experimentation where people are being brought in and interviewed. It may also be just looking at artifacts of human behavior, including media, film, print, or it may actually just be observation where we're setting up in a public place and looking at how people behave. In those cases, consent would not be given. Deception is often used to gain access to populations, so unlike experimental research or quasi-experimental research, where usually people are very aware of what's going on, and if there is deception, it's usually been reviewed by an internal review board, and it's usually revealed to participants afterwards. We'll actually find that a fair amount of quantitative methods, deception is part of how we get this observation. So for example, if you're an experimenter at a mall in a public space, taking notes about how people behave, they don't know they're being studied. That is deception. If you're wanting to, for example, research the interplay of how people behave in a criminal organization, you may use deception to gain access to that organization. Now, again, this will have to be going through an institutional review board, but it is more common to find deception in qualitative studies. Also, psychologists are less likely, not exclusively, but they're less likely to use these methods. Most psychology studies fall more into the quasi or the full experimental design, which is what we're covering in this class. So this is more commonly used by sociologists and anthropologists, but it should be noted that the psychological theories are usually based on the research that's already been done in these fields by other specialists. So when we're analyzing qualitative research, one of the best ways to do this is probably grounded theory, and the idea behind this is to go through the rich data and look for meaning nodes or meaning units, sort these into themes, patterns, and categories, and create hierarchies. We want to keep track of who said what in what context, and we basically want to look for a lack of fit for the person versus the content. So there's a lot to this. This, again, I'm basically bringing down a book worth of information into a few slides just to kind of give you an idea of how this is done. One of the other things to think about is, generally speaking, when we're doing this, we're working backwards. We're starting with a large group of data, basically full interview reports, for example, or we're looking at multiple movies. We then look through those materials for the general meaning unit. So, for example, I might have 3 paragraphs of someone talking, but they're basically talking about 4 ideas. I would write these 4 ideas down. I would then sort those ideas across multiple people looking for patterns. Do I see the themes repeat over and over again? And then based on that, I'd create these hierarchies. So here's just a very simple example. We would start with the nodes. So these are the actual thoughts that we actually gather through qualitative research. So for example, he should watch his kids more. She always forgets to pick them up. She lets them watch too much TV. He spends too much on the kids. Those would be ideas. Then we'd start to think about what categories. Well, they're all in childcare, so that's a broad category. A few of them might be reliability. A few of them might be spending, and there may be additional. So, example, under categories, I have childcare, responsibility, and faithfulness. Well, none of these really get necessarily at faithfulness. Under spending, I might have bills going out and spontaneity. Again, in this case, it might just be bills. And then there's the broad themes, trust and spending. So again, you can see this idea that we start with the actual original ideas. We then try to create categories that those ideas fit in. And from those categories, we try to create broader themes. And how we actually check to see if this would be replicatable is we often have multiple people going through this process and seeing if they come up with similar or very similar themes and categories from the same data. If not, we may have to go back in and look at it more in detail. Some other observational techniques. So example, one of the biggest things that we look at when we're talking about qualitative research is observational research. Methods can include checklists, behavioral codes, ethnologies, observational natural behaviors that focus on detailed descriptions of behavior rather than looking for single characteristics. So example, we're often doing these when we're looking at animal behavior, or ethnograms, an exhaustive list of all possible behaviors, often used as checklists when observing behavior, i.e. rats in a Skinner's box. So again, one of the ways that we often are trying to create more of a systematic, replicatable way to do qualitative, non-experimental research is to come up with these behavioral codes, these ethnologies, or these ethnograms that we can then use and have multiple researchers use those same tools. The advantages of doing observational research: it gives us great insight in determining real-world behavior. It's typically easier to generalize to larger populations, and it's good for research that may be unethical to manipulate. So, for example, we might be interested in public arguments. That would be a hard thing to legally and ethically or even practically generate. In other words, force people into making public arguments. But observing public arguments might give us a lot of information about how people behave in the real world. Spanking behavior, again, might be something that's unethical to actually basically randomly assign people to spank or not spank their kids. But we might also be able to observe the effects of spanking and who's doing spanking in an observational study. So the disadvantages of observational research includes it can be time consuming. So sometimes we just have to wait for the behavior we're interested in researching. So if you're interested in public arguments, you may actually pick an area where public arguments are more likely, but you may be spending days waiting for someone to actually get into a public argument. Once the behavior starts, you cannot be disrupted. So in other words, you have to just observe. You can't stop and go, hold on, stop that argument. I have some questions. And there also is some subjective interpretations, especially if only one person is making the observations. We're often looking for what's called inter-rater reliability. In other words, we want multiple people to observe the behavior and see if they're coming up with similar conclusions. And finally, there is no consent. This is technically a kind of an act of spying, and there's some ethical concerns there that need to be addressed. So let's start talking about different ways to do experimental research. The first one is going to be content analysis. Content analysis measures behavior from books, movies, TVs, and other media. It tends to be qualitative, but it can be quantitative. And examples are sex and family, fashion, casual, conservative, stylish, sexual roles of men and women. So again, just think about if you were interested in how the roles of biological sex between men and women in movies has occurred, you can basically do this by looking at movies made in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, etc., looking for differences in the roles, differences in how the expectations are there. You can also look for similarities, and you could find both. And that is one of the ways that you could look at both how behavior is being represented, but also how it's being changed over time. So again, this can also be just using the internet. So for example, this is a study that was actually not an actual scientific study. This was actually just someone that indexed by the number of Google research. So they basically put in died in a blank accident, and they put in various words for the accident: skydiving, elevator, surfing, skateboarding, camping, gardening, ice skating, knitting, and blogging. This isn't the actual number of deaths. This is the number of Google results from a Google search. This was done about 15 years ago, actually, that looks at this. This would again be an example of content analysis. We're not directly observing the behavior. We're not actually going out and watching people do these things. We're simply using secondary sources, news sources, internet sources, movies and TV, to look at the content to look for trends. So the advantages to content analysis: easy to obtain and no risk of influence or disruption. No one knows we're observing them. We're basically observing the existing records. The disadvantage is it tends to not be natural. It's created by the directors, the people that are entering this information, and exaggerated. So for example, in the last example, we could look at the roles of females in movies, and we could look at King Kong in the 1930s, where basically the biological female is a damsel in distress, and we could look at Ripley in the movie Aliens in the 1980s, early 1990s, and we could see a very big difference in those roles. At the same time, are women in the 1980s grabbing flamethrowers and attacking aliens? No, that's an exaggerated, created by directors, reflection of society and what's expected. Also, as far as the Google searches, there could also be a lot of people that are just basically searching for things because that's what's currently scaring them, not necessarily because it's occurring more often. So again, we have to recognize that as well. In the next lecture, we'll continue talking about different types of qualitative analysis and different ways to look at non-experimental designs.